Okay, hand me the acai.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Who knows? They should really just call them overpriced blueberries for douchebags. How's life?
Well, the truth is actually
Didn't catch that, but everything's cool.
no. In fact, I've never felt so alone in my own.
Sorry, you missed it. You should learn to talk louder, dude. Oh, hey, bummer about you getting the milk.
And you know who was there for me?
We're looking at the first of a three-part series on actor analysis. So this one is looking at the most granular level of actor analysis you can do, which is on individuals, the individual psychology, and how they interact with, for example, when you pass emotion about narratives, trying to get them to do something. So talking about how individuals are likely going to respond. So first of all, why do you need different kinds of actor analysis in the first place? So all debates, basically, except for like the really high level ethics ones where you just debate about ethics in a vacuum, almost all other debates require you to do some level of actor analysis, because most debates would be about someone doing something. So typically, we decided to characterize these actors taking place on three basic scales. So first you have the largest kind of actor, right, which are probably states in international relations type motions. Then you have the next level of actor, which is probably social movements and communities. So these are probably, like not individuals yet, but they characterize communities, how they're likely going to respond, what they care about, or social movements. So, for example, getting the feminist movement to adopt a specific narrative and understanding what the feminist movement wants. And then the most gradual level, which is what we're going to be looking at today, which is individuals. So getting individual people to try to do something in response to emotion. So note that there are lots of debates that look at a mixture of these kind of three actors. So sometimes you'll have a kind of debate, maybe about voting, where the government will try to pass a policy that engages with people on an individual level. But these are broadly the three kinds of scales of actors that you'll engage with in a debate. Note that all types of actor analysis require you to identify two specific kinds of things. So all kinds of actors, no matter what kind of actor you're analyzing, be it a state or social movement or an individual, all have incentives, and they all have different capacities to act. So what do I mean by this? So incentives are basically what we want out of life. So these are like your goals in life. So for example, a state may want to remain in power with the people. They may want to get elected. Maybe they're on an international stage. They want international influence, prestige, prosperity for their state. Individuals, maybe if it's an economics motion, maybe they want to do things like get socioeconomic mobility. So these are all incentives that we all have. These are goals that we generally want in life, and we all have capacities to achieve those goals. So what do I mean by this? So note that we all have different capacities to try to pursue what we want in life, right? So for example, I really want to be the smartest and best person in debate, but note that my capacity to do that is limited in lots of different ways. Maybe by my inherent talent that I was born with. Maybe it is the time that I can devote to being the best debater in the entire world. Maybe it's because I'm just unaware about how to train myself to be the best debater in the entire world. So these all limit my ability to pursue my overall goal or incentive. So that's what characterizes my capacity to act to achieve a goal. So that's what I mean by incentives and capacities to act. So no matter what kind of actor analysis you do, be it a state or an individual, you always have to identify what does this actor want and how are they able to achieve that. So, but note that different types of actors are very different in number one, how they understand and construct their incentives, and number two, their decision-making process, so how they think about making decisions. So these are the kind of things that people, even high-level debaters, struggle a little bit to understand. And so, for example, the way a state understands what is in its best interest and what therefore it desires is very different from how, for example, an individual constructs their incentives. So for example, I as an individual want power the same way a state does, but maybe a state says like, hey, we can't just randomly, for example, persecute all our people, even if it means that we can become an authoritarian regime with power because maybe that makes us look bad on the global stage. So maybe the layers of how they construct their own incentives are very different because they go through rationally how they are best able to be, maximally powerful, but still not detriment international image. Or an individual may not go through all those levels of analysis when trying to understand their own incentives or trying to act to pursue those incentives in the first place. So therefore, there needs to be different kinds of actor analysis that you do on different scales. So states will be different from social movements, will be different from individuals. Today, we're looking at individuals. So next slide. So individual actors, people tend to be even though I think it is the most basic kind of actor analysis, some people tend to be bad at it because it is so basic, right? They skip a lot of it simply because they see that a lot of actor analysis is very intuitive. And especially if you're kind of a newer type of debater, you kind of do have that perception or pressure to sound smart in the debate, to use lots of jargony language, to say lots of sophisticated new things. In reality, really good, robust individual actor analysis just requires you to put yourself in the shoes of someone and understand how they feel or think. This doesn't require jargon and it doesn't require complicated spec knowledge. It just requires you to deeply characterize who someone is, so someone's identity, and therefore how they're likely going to respond to something. So that is the crux of what individual actor analysis is. So first, we're going to look at how people understand their own incentives. So here are loads of questions that have appeared to me in loads of debates I've done in the past. So for example, if it's a feminist motion, maybe something that you'll come across is, why are some men sexist even though they know and respect many women in their lives? So why is there cognitive dissonance there? Why do so many new immigrants socialize with people from their home country and speak their native language rather than attempting to assimilate? So for example, if you see lots of international students in a university, maybe something you've noticed is that lots of international students tend to group together with similar international students from their home country. They maybe speak their own native language and they don't try to interact with local students or domestic students. So why is this the case? Most of us will question just like, oh, you came to the UK, why aren't you just like trying to assimilate into local culture? And the crux to the answer to this question is understanding how people feel when they are placed in a new situation. Or the final one that I had to debate in the Euros a few years ago is, why do some gay people never choose to act on their homosexuality? Also, for example, to choose to pursue homosexual sexual relationships or romantic homosexual relationships. So why do some gay people never choose to act on their homosexuality in order to stay in a faith that says, being LGBTQ plus is sinful? So loads of, for example, gay Christians will choose to never act on their homosexuality if it means continuing to be Christian. So to lots of us, a lot of these actions, like for example, never choosing to assimilate if you're a new immigrant, being sexist as a man, even though you know and respect women in your everyday life, like your mother or your sister, or being a LGBT person and choosing to prioritize your faith over your own sexual orientation, loads of these from the outside looking in seem irrational. And they are all ultimately decisions colored by the individual actors' past experiences, their personal beliefs and convictions that make them completely intuitive in the shoes of that person. So if you, like from the outside looking in, we may not understand why people do things. But in order to debate these actors particularly well and therefore characterize how they're likely going to act, it's very important to put ourselves in the shoes of that person and understand all the different factors that make all these decisions seem completely intuitive and seem completely rational. Cool. So let's unpack what this means. So what are incentives shaped by? So I identified three main incentives, main factors that influence how people construct their incentives, right? So first of all is their past experiences or lack thereof. So it really controls how, for example, an individual understands situations, for example, whether or not they can critically assess that situation, whether they can, whether they believe taking specific actions are likely going to result in success. And it also affects what they perceive as foreign or familiar, right? So if you're looking at, for example, some, for example, ethnic minorities who come from really socioeconomically impoverished backgrounds. So lots of questions about like, oh, why don't they ever try to get into university, or why don't they ever, try to like, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and ascend the socioeconomic ladder? Well, you can look at their past experiences, right? So, for example, growing up in a household that was impoverished, seeing maybe parents try really hard to provide for their kids, maybe sometimes failing, living a life of financial instability, where just that kind of socioeconomic success is very, very, very unlikely for them. So because of all those cumulative past experiences of failure, when you try to get socioeconomic success, that maybe means that in the future, if the opportunity arises again for you to ascend the socioeconomic ladder, just not going to take it, because you just see that it's kind of unlikely for it to ever work. So that's what I mean by how past experiences shape how you understand your incentives. So even though, like, of course, like socioeconomically impoverished people have the incentive to become more, rich, or to become more prosperous, the way they understand for example, the probability of that happening is shaped by their past experiences. Similarly, by what I mean by affects what they perceive as foreign and familiar. If you're trying to look at, why people are xenophobic to other people, or people are racist to certain cultural habits that other cultures or communities have, maybe it's because they just haven't had social contact with this kind of community or this kind of ethnicity before, and so they perceive it as very foreign. And so therefore have like a instinctually kind of like gut reaction that this thing may be very dangerous to them. So that's why they maybe express it in racism and xenophobia to things that seem unfamiliar to them. And so therefore, when you're debating something about like, getting people to become normalized to other things, you can look at, this kind of level of analysis. Second point that I identified is socialized beliefs and opinions. So for example, beliefs held by your community and your family. So it really influences how people weigh different priorities in their life, because loads of us want loads of different kinds of things. The way that we choose to prioritize which ones to actually pursue and spend time on and which ones to sacrifice are, shaped by socialized beliefs and opinions. So for example, the example that I said in the last slide about how some, LGBT Christians choose to prioritize staying in their faith rather than, for example, pursuing or expressing their sexual orientations or pursuing gay relationships. So loads of people will just choose never to act on that sexual orientation in order to stay in their faith. And so understanding why people make certain sacrifices or they make certain specific decisions to prioritize certain interests, you have to look at that community. What kind of community did they grow up in? What kind of people do they value? So for example, growing up with a family that was maybe heavily Christian, having loads of friends that are Christian, having an entire community that is Christian. Maybe you love all these people and these people are genuinely meaningful to you in your life. And therefore, the way they are brought up to think about like what is important in life has been influenced by all these loved ones around you. And so this means that people who have grown up in that faith just genuinely believe that their faith is more important than, for example, other things, like maybe expressing a sexual orientation. And so that's how you look at, whether or not if an LGBT movement was going to try to reach out to them, say that it's okay to express one's sexuality, would they actually change their mind if you actually approach them and try to convert them to expressing their homosexuality? So the last and final thing that you can look at is who they perceive to be in their in-group and who they perceive to be in the out-group. And so this is really important when you look at, for example, like insular communities or communities where they believe that they are under attack by a different outgroup. So for example, when a feminist movement, attacks or condemns men for doing something. So you can talk about how like men maybe perceive other men to be in their in-group, but they perceive feminists or women to be in the out-group. So the way they prioritize or they value the statements of people in the out-group is very different from how they value statements made in the in-group. And so because of this, you can talk about how effective it is to, challenge internalized beliefs and prejudices as a person from an out-group versus trying to convert someone in the in-group that then converts the others in that in-group. So how people perceive the in-group and the out-group outgroup controls who they prioritize protecting more. So maybe they prioritize protecting people who they perceive to be in their in-group and who can influence them to a greater degree. So they probably value statements made by people in their in-group rather than in their out-group. So hopefully that makes sense. If there are any questions whatsoever, there's a chat that I'll be regularly checking, hopefully. And you can ask me any questions. Let's check it now. Nope, no questions so far. Also, feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. Cool. Next slide. So next step is, what is decision-making shaped by? Now we have looked at how are incentives constructed and viewed by an individual. Let's look at how individuals decide how to make decisions, right? So there are three main things that I broadly identified. Firstly is note that unlike states or social movements, individuals have very limited amount of time and bandwidth. So states have entire administrations and departments devoted to making decisions, right? They have like foreign policy experts that just go from 9 to 5 thinking about what's the most rational decision to make in terms of international game theory. In social movements, you have loads of activists attempting to understand, like how to best promote a narrative particularly well or something like that. Now, individuals are very different because the pressure of resources and time and bandwidth, it's far more pressing because, as an individual, I have limited amount of time to go to work, to come home to relax, and to then think about all these other things that emotion asks me to engage with. So what happens a lot of time is that people default to what we call heuristics. Heuristics is just a fancy way of saying shortcuts in our head. So an example of a shortcut many of us have is that, because every day we wake up, we maybe don't have much time in the morning to decide what we want to eat for breakfast. A lot of us have like simple rules about what we have for breakfast. So a lot of us will eat the same thing for breakfast every day. So we just don't have to make that decision and spend time making that decision every day. Most of us will just have coffee, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a simple rule that we just made in our head that we live our lives by in order to save time because of that limited time and bandwidth. So if you ever want to look at how individuals make decisions, you can analyze the heuristics that go on in the individual's head, as well as just like how likely is it that they're going to make a super sophisticated, hyper-rational decision when they have limited time and bandwidth. So this is especially really important in lots of motions about voting, because lots of debaters will come out and say, like, of course, individuals will do proper game theory in their head and understand whether or not they live in a swing state and will put their vote where it matters most. Note that individuals have to go to work. They have limited amount of time to engage with political news. They probably will just vote for the party that best aligns with their beliefs or that their family has historically voted for. Because lots of people just don't go through that immense time-intensive and resource-intensive process of making the best decision ever. They just default to easy heuristics. And so that's a layer of analysis that you can access specifically on the individual level. Let me check the chat again, just in case there are people asking questions. How do you do actor analysis when you describe how a person behaves and not why? Like if it's a specific person, like a politician. Can you clarify what that question means?
Yeah. So it was the Manchester IV motion about Narendra Modi, and I'm like, in the round, I was like, I know that Modi is an authoritarian and so on, like nationalist and whatever. I don't know why he's any of those things.
I see. So like, I think, okay, so a lot of characterization is a little bit asserty, but I think the way they make it less asserty is just saying like, look, obviously he is these things because it serves his interests, right? So for example, he is a nationalist because maybe being a nationalist is just popular with Indian people. And so because of that wins him elections, right? And then you can analyze, okay, so why is nationalism particularly like salient with Indian people, for example? And then that's how you make pieces of characterization a little bit less asserty. But if it's an individual person, like a politician, I think you can just say like, look, here are the broad incentives that they have, which is like maybe winning an election, not getting caught by the FBI for tampering with elections, etc. And then a lot of your actor analysis can then be about structures around that person. So for example, what is society receptive to? So for example, is Indian society receptive to nationalism? And if it is, maybe that's why Modi chooses a nationalist strategy. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome, great. So second point about decision making and what decision making is shaped by. So behavior that is valued within a community or taught. So loads of people feel pressured into a specific behavior because it allows them continued access to a community. And so this sounds like really convoluted for what is a very simple concept, right? It's really just about like, look, if you're out with the lads, and then you kind of maybe want to talk about, internal, like really like the mental strife that you've been going through lockdown. And your group is maybe one that doesn't really openly talk about their feelings a lot. And that kind of behavior is shamed to openly talk about your feelings because you're seen as weak and vulnerable and not particularly masculine. Even if your incentive is to maybe share and communicate your feelings, you're just highly limited because the behavior that is valued within your specific community or taught within your specific community is very different from what your incentives are. So for example, like men who grow up in a culture of, for example, toxic masculinity may react aggressively to feelings that they do not understand because maybe they reside in a culture that rewards aggressiveness as a sign of dominance, as a sign of power and masculinity. And actually, it does not teach them any alternative actions, like, for example, reconciliation, introspection, and communication. So behavior that is valued as well as taught within a community highly limits an individual and their ability to make decisions. And then finally, you have other factors, right? So resources, the fear of backlash, all limit our abilities and choose how we then proceed to make decisions. So for example, many external limitations are more relevant to some communities over others. So let's say that you're looking at individual artists. So like, let's say you're a musician, and this is a motion that me and Lucy had a debate recently in the past, is about musicians who reclaim kind of profane, I think, language, profane language. So think about like rap by Cardi B. Think about like there's loads of like really profane language in rap music. So it was about whether or not you should support individual artists doing that kind of thing. And so note that if you are a maybe cis white male artist, the kind of backlash that you may get from maybe reclaiming or using a lot of profanity in your music is very different from, for example, a small-time minority woman artist. And because like maybe she's much more fearful of backlash if she ever uses profanity in her music because she does not have as many, bodyguards around her. She does not have as many resources to protect herself with. Her entire music career could be endangered because she is a small-time artist. Furthermore, maybe she just gets more backlash because people are more offended when people from more disprivileged backgrounds attempt to reclaim profanity than maybe someone from a privileged background. And so because of this, some external limitations like the fear of backlash resources are more relevant to specific actors than they are to other actors. So when you're analyzing individual actors, try to be sensitive to kinds of these things because it unlocks loads of other new analysis that you can see. Cool. I think the next slide is some examples. Oh wait, no, it's a note. It's a note to lots of debaters. So one thing that I think loads of people make a mistake of doing is that they believe that being irrational is the same thing as being random. So this is like, even if you're looking at people like, even if as a flippant statement, just like, people may challenge you by saying, why would Kim Jong-un from North Korea ever use his nuclear arsenal? Like, would he ever actually launch a nuclear missile? And loads of people are just like, oh yeah, like he probably would because he's an irrational actor. He's of course a dictator, so yeah, he probably would. And so note that this isn't a reason. Irrational doesn't mean that he acts completely randomly, and just like decides to randomly like launch a bunch of nuclear missiles. Lots of debaters, especially novices, think that people being irrational is the same thing as being random. Irrational actors just means that people often take actions that are perceived by others to be against their own self-interest. But in the shoes of that actor, taking into account of their life experiences and limitations of that behavior, their actions make complete sense. So a lot of it is, for example, like if a promotion opening is up in your workplace, lots of, for example, women or minorities don't put themselves forward for that promotion, even if they're completely qualified for that promotion or for that specific position. And loads of people say like, oh, that's really irrational because you risk losing nothing by putting yourself forward for a promotion. But in maybe the shoes of a woman, maybe she's has internalized shame or embarrassment. She says like, oh, maybe she has low self-esteem because of patriarchy. She says like I shouldn't even waste people's time by putting my application out there. I'm never ever going to get it. So a sense of defeatism already before she's even tried. And so in her shoes, this action makes complete sense because of all her past experiences, the limitations of her behavior that we already discussed in the past. So just be careful not to skip entire blocks of logic and gloss it over with just, X actor is irrational, therefore they're likely going to do any action. So just be careful not to make that mistake. What I've taught this entire workshop has just been about how do you understand how different people are likely going to be irrational in very different ways, because all people are irrational, but people are irrational in very different ways depending on the background they come from and depending on the external circumstances that limit their abilities to act. And this is what this entire workshop has been about. So try to understand how your specific actor is irrational in a very specific way, and therefore how they're likely going to respond to emotion being passed. Cool. So I think now we have some examples. So this is a recent example that we had to go through. This house believes that ethnic communities should not shame their members for being whitewashed. So for those that don't know, being whitewashed is basically, I wouldn't say it's a slur, but it's kind of a derogatory thing to call an ethnic person. It's basically accusing them of just adopting lots of white qualities, and that being seen as bad because it's seen as you abandoning your true authentic culture. It seems like you've lost your way in order to get white acceptance. So for example, it looks like maybe I'm a Chinese person, maybe it looks like me not being able to speak Mandarin fluently because I spent my entire life trying to speak English fluently. So maybe I get accused of being whitewashed because I am more white than I am Chinese, for example. So a good government case will just say okay, so let's say this is the broad argument the government wants to make. So those who are perceived to be whitewashed are deeply hurt by this kind of shaming and will turn away from the ethnic minority communities, taking away lifelines of support that could be very valuable to that individual ethnic minority that you have turned away, while possibly draining the community of potentially valuable membership or resources. So the community themselves also lose that person and all the valuable things they could have added back to the community. So this is the main argument that you maybe want to make in government. So first you can look at the incentive, right? Looking at how maybe individuals feel I'm just going to call them third culture people because maybe they are not quite fully ethnic or they are not quite fully westernized. They kind of reside somewhere in that third culture. So when third culture minorities live in a white world, you can say that they feel excluded by what they desire the most, you can identify, is a community where they feel like they're not an outsider because they kind of live in this awkward space where they don't fully feel maybe they're one of their white friends that they go to school with. They always feel like an outsider because maybe they have optical differences with other races. You can say that growing up as a third culture kid, what you want the most is a community where you feel like you belong somewhere, right? So when you, as for example, an ethnic community, say that actually these third culture kids, they're all whitewashed, they're not true ethnic minorities. When ethnic communities cast these people out, they suffer from a double exclusion. And so you can even say that the rejection from the ethnic community is likely going to hurt these third culture minorities more, maybe because they perceive that this could be their family, people who optically look like them and so therefore suffer from the same structures of racism, and so they expect to have sympathy for them. When you are rejected by your own family and people you expect to understand your struggle, it could end up hurting a lot more. So by identifying the incentive of these third culture kids, what they want most is a community, and when you reject that community to them, you can characterize the severity of harm that you impart on them and why they're going to be turned away. So this is the next part. So now we've characterized the severity of harm. why does it now turn them away? So this decision-making process, when you are faced with, as a third culture individual with extreme hurt, many individuals often choose to turn away from the source of the pain. This is especially true when many whitewashed people just have no capacity to change their behavior, right? So for example, when I am degraded as a whitewashed individual, I choose to turn away from my community, because it's not like I can suddenly gain that acceptance, because I can't suddenly become fluent in Mandarin. I can't suddenly, be everything that my mother wants me to be. So in order to preserve myself, in order to defend myself from further hurt, what's likely going to happen is that I turn away from the ethnic community that has rejected me. So this is how you do, you characterize the incentive of that person, looking at their past life experiences, and then how you characterize how they're likely going to make a decision, i.e. that instead of they're likely going to turn away from an ethnic community rather than trying to appease that ethnic community. Cool. Hope that's clear. Let me check for questions in the chat. Nope, nothing yet. And final example before we go into the SPAR. So this was the final motion that I set. So this house opposes the normalization of female fantasies that center around gendered power imbalances. For example, 50 Shades of Grey. So loads of for example, female-oriented media. For example, 50 Shades of Grey. I think there was a Netflix series called You that was basically very marketed towards women, that have a lot of dynamics where the male the male love interest is in a far more powerful position than the female protagonist. So it's about whether or not you oppose the normalization of a lot of these kinds of media and a lot of these kinds of female fantasy. So the big clash in the debate that this came down to was government asserting no, women can't know the difference between fantasy and reality, because if they grow up just watching this media all the time, they're going to think that gendered power imbalances are actually okay, and this is really harmful because they won't be able to recognize when they're in a toxic relationship, etc. And so opposition maybe sometimes counter asserted that no, actually women can distinguish facts from fiction. So how do you actually actually analyze whether or not individual women can tell facts from fiction? So the op claim is that women can tell differences between fantasy and reality. And then this is the argument: indulging in fantasy is often a necessary way that women reclaim control over their sexual desires. To stigmatize it would be to shame women for fantasies the patriarchy has imparted on them. So, so first of all, let's substantiate the first claim. Why can women tell fantasy from reality? And we can identify, probably past experiences. Women are not stupid. Women have lived with the harms of patriarchy every day. Maybe they feel unsafe when they go out on the street. Maybe they feel like they get talked over in the workplace, etc., etc. So they, out of all people, due to their lived experiences, understand the harms of gender power imbalances. So they probably therefore understand that these gendered power imbalances shown in things like 50 Shades of Grey is just an escapist fantasy, and if it happened in real life, it probably wouldn't be good. And so that's how you can substantiate that claim that women can tell fantasy from reality. So therefore, let's then ask the substantiate the second claim, that it's the important part of reclaiming sexual desire for these women. So why do women enjoy 50 Shades of Grey? Well, probably because many women grow up under the system of patriarchy, which means that their experiences of sexual desire can be very gendered, right? So, for example, many women may enjoy being dominated because that's what society has kind of socialized into them. So there's no point asking about whether or not this is the correct sexual desire to have, just that many women do have it just because they live under patriarchy. And so you can say that most women will have this desire on either side of the house. On our side, we can at least allow them to enjoy this fantasy when it's under their control, right? When it is, for example, in a book that they can open and shut, when they can have the freedom to share it with friends that also share their experiences, who won't shame them for having, for example, a 50 Shades of Grey book inside their room. And so because of this, you can say look, on either side, most women, because of socialized beliefs and opinions, probably have these sexual desires anyway. It's about whether or not you allow them a safe space where they understand that this is an escapist fantasy to enjoy and reclaim that sexual desire for their own and enjoy it. Cool. So these are two examples about how you can do individual actor analysis. So note that I still talk broadly about like women and in this slide, third cultural individuals. So these are still groups, but note that a lot of the analysis that I do is on an individual level. So how an individual is likely going to feel, respond. It's not on a really broad stroke. So this is what we mean by individual actor analysis. Great. So are there any questions before we go ahead into the SPAR? Okay, if not, Lucy, is the tab ready?